Mountain Man took in 2 homeless kids. 20 years later, they stopped his execution. Snow whips across a lonely mountain trail. A rugged man pushes through the storm, hearing faint cries. 2 half-frozen children lie beside an overturned wagon. He lifts them into his arms, never knowing that saving their lives will one day save his own. Years pass. Laughter fills his cabin. Prayers echo against the walls. But then the church bell tolls, the jail door slams, and the noose tightens around his neck. The townsfolk cheer for his hanging, their eyes blind to the truth. Yet, in the crowd stand 2 figures, no longer children but the family he once rescued. They hold proof that could topple the cattle baron's lies, if they can get to him before the rope drops. Will the bond of love forged in snow and fire be enough to stop an unjust death? Or will mercy come too late? Your comments remind me that we're not alone in feeling deeply. If loyalty, second chances, and human dignity mean something to you, then you're right where you belong. The bitter December wind howled across the mountainside, driving needles of snow into Elias Boone's weathered face. His boots crunched through knee-deep drifts as he followed the familiar trail to his line shack. The setting sun cast long shadows through the pine trees, painting the white landscape in shades of purple and blue. Elias pulled his buffalo coat tighter, his thoughts as dark as the gathering night. 20 years of trapping had left him with little more than calloused hands and memories he'd rather forget. The weight of his past pressed down harder than the storm clouds above. A sound caught his ear, faint and nearly lost in the wind. He stopped, head cocked. There it came again, a whimper like a wounded animal, but something about it made his chest tighten. Following the sound, he pushed through a stand of snow-laden spruce. His heart stopped at what he found in the gathering gloom. An overturned wagon lay half-buried in a drift, its canvas cover torn and flapping. But it was the 2 small figures huddled against the wooden wheel that seized his attention. 2 children, a boy and a girl, clung to each other like frightened rabbits. The boy, perhaps 8 years old, had wrapped his thin arms around his younger sister, trying to shield her from the deadly cold. Their clothes were summer weight, completely inadequate for the mountain winter. "Dear Lord," Elias breathed, dropping to his knees beside them. The boy's dark eyes met his, wary but too exhausted to flee. "Help," the boy whispered through blue-tinged lips. "Please, my sister." Elias's gaze swept the scene, his experienced eyes reading the tragedy written in the snow. A woman's body lay partially covered by the torn canvas, her skin the color of ice. No sign of a father. His jaw clenched at the thought of anyone abandoning children to such a fate. "I'm here now," he said gruffly, shrugging off his buffalo coat. "Let's get you warm." He wrapped the massive coat around both children, lifting them together in his arms. The girl whimpered, but the boy remained silent, watching Elias's face with an intensity that spoke of too much suffering for one so young. "What's your names?" Elias asked, as he started the trudge back to his shack. He needed to keep them talking, keep them awake. "To Daniel," the boy managed. "She's Mary Beth, our ma." His voice cracked. "I know, son, I know." Elias's throat tightened. "Your pa?" Daniel's face hardened. "Gone. Said we weren't his problem no more." The words hit Elias like a physical blow. His own past rose up like a ghost. The men he'd killed, the lives he'd destroyed in his younger days. Was this God's judgment? To confront him with innocent suffering he couldn't ignore? The line shack appeared through the swirling snow, a dark shape against the white. Elias shouldered through the door, setting the children down beside the cold fireplace. His hands shook as he built up the fire, not entirely from the cold. "Stay put," he ordered, though neither child looked capable of moving. He melted snow in his battered coffee pot, then pulled out his last strip of dried venison. The children watched his every move with desperate hunger. As warmth slowly filled the cramped space, Elias cut the venison into small pieces. He knelt beside them, helping them sip water and take tiny bites of meat. Their whispered conversation carried to him as he worked. "Will he keep us, Danny?" Mary Beth's voice trembled. "Don't know. Nobody else wanted us. I'm scared. I'll take care of you, Beth. I promise." Elias's hands stilled on the coffee pot. The words echoed in his mind, stirring memories of prayers muttered in dark moments. How many times had he begged forgiveness for his past? How many nights had he wondered if redemption was possible for a man like him? Now here sat 2 children, abandoned and alone, delivered to his doorstep on this bitter night. Was it punishment? Or was it something else entirely? The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the shack, something was changing. Elias watched the children huddle closer to each other, their eyes growing heavy with exhaustion and belly-warming food. He spread his bedroll near the fire, adding his spare blankets. "Time for sleep," he said gruffly. "We'll figure things out come morning." The children looked at him with such naked hope that his chest ached. As they settled onto the bedroll, Mary Beth reached for his rough hand. "Thank you, mister," she whispered. "Elias," he corrected softly. "Name's Elias Boone." Daniel's dark eyes studied him. "You won't leave us?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Elias felt the weight of it, the responsibility those words carried. He thought of the woman lying dead in the snow, of the father who had abandoned his blood kin to the wilderness. He thought of his own bloody past, and the chance that lay before him now. "No, son," he said finally. "I won't leave you." The children fell asleep, holding hands, their faces peaceful in the firelight. Elias sat beside them, watching the flames and listening to their soft breathing mix with the howling wind outside. Tomorrow he would need to deal with their mother's body, to make decisions about what came next. But for now, in this moment, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Purpose. These children needed him. Maybe this wasn't punishment after all. Maybe, just maybe, it was the answer to those midnight prayers for redemption. He added another log to the fire and settled in for his vigil, his weathered hand resting protectively near the children's sleeping forms. The storm could rage all it wanted. Inside this humble shack, a new kind of warmth was growing. Morning crept over the mountains like a fragile thing, its pale light filtering through the frost-covered window of Elias's line shack. The fire had burned low during the night, leaving only glowing embers that cast a faint warmth across the small room. Elias stirred from his position against the wall, his joints stiff from keeping watch through the long hours. The children still slept, huddled together under his blankets. In the wan light, their features seemed even more delicate, their Cherokee heritage evident in the high cheekbones and straight black hair. Elias's heart grew heavy, knowing the prejudices that awaited them in the settlements below. He had seen how the townsfolk treated such children, their cruel words and colder shoulders. Moving quietly, he added wood to the fire and set his battered pot to boil. The familiar motions of mourning brought comfort, even as his mind wrestled with what the future might hold. From his meager stores, he pulled dried beans and the last handful of corn, adding them to the pot with a precious pinch of salt. Daniel woke first, his dark eyes alert and wary. The boy pushed himself up on one elbow, careful not to disturb his sister. "Morning, son," Elias said softly. "Broth's almost ready." The boy's chin lifted slightly. "I ain't hungry." "Course you are." Elias stirred the pot. "No shame in eating when food's offered." Daniel's face flushed, but his stomach betrayed him with a loud growl. Mary Beth stirred at the sound, her small hand reaching out until it found her brother's arm. Her eyes opened, wide and solemn in her thin face. Elias ladled the hot broth into tin cups, holding one out to Daniel. The boy hesitated, pride warring with hunger on his face. Finally, he took the cup, though his hands trembled slightly. Marybeth made no such show of resistance. She crept closer to Elias, her tiny fingers clutching his buckskin sleeve as she accepted her portion. The gesture, so trusting and childlike, made Elias's throat tighten unexpectedly. "Small sips now?" he instructed, watching them drink. "Been too long since you ate proper?" The morning passed slowly as Elias tended to his unexpected charges. He found an old shirt that, with some creative cutting and rough stitching, made a warmer garment for Marybeth. Daniel watched every move, his eyes following Elias's hands as though memorizing each task. "Reckon you're strong enough to help with the wood?" Elias asked the boy, noting his restless energy. Daniel straightened. "Yes, sir, I can work." "Come on, then." Elias handed him a small hatchet. "Show you how to split kindling proper." Outside, the snow had drifted halfway up the cabin's walls. Elias showed Daniel how to break down smaller branches, adjusting the boy's grip on the hatchet handle. Though Daniel's strikes were weak at first, his determination never wavered. "My pa," Daniel began, then stopped, his face darkening. "Your pa ain't here," Elias said quietly. "But you're doing fine all the same." Marybeth watched from the doorway, wrapped in a blanket. Her soft voice carried across the snow. "Can I help too?" Elias nodded. "Need snow melted for water. I'll show you how to pick the clean stuff away from the trees." The girl's face lit up at having a task of her own. Soon she was carefully filling a bucket with white snow, selecting each scoop with serious concentration. As darkness fell that evening, the storm returned, bringing fresh snow and howling winds. The children huddled closer to the fire, their earlier confidence wavering in the face of nature's fury. Marybeth's lip trembled as a particularly strong gust rattled the cabin's shutters. "Mama used to sing when it stormed," she whispered. "She knew all the hymns." Daniel's arm went around his sister's shoulders. "Remember Amazing Grace?" That was her favorite. Elias watched them share this memory of their mother, their faces both sad and sweet in the firelight. Without speaking, he reached for his pack, pulling out a worn Bible. Its leather cover was smooth from years of handling, its pages dog-eared and familiar. "Can't sing worth a lick," he said gruffly, "but I can read some if you'd like." The children nodded, shifting closer as Elias trimmed the lamp and opened the Bible. His rough voice grew smoother as he read familiar passages, the ancient words filling the cabin with something larger than their small circle of warmth. The storm raged for 3 more days, trapping them in their own small world. Each day brought new lessons, Daniel learning to bank the fire for the night, Marybeth discovering how to wash dishes with melted snow. Elias found himself sharing knowledge he had not known he possessed, teaching them the small skills that made survival possible. At night, they would gather around the Bible, its stories becoming part of their evening ritual. Sometimes the children would share memories of their mother, brief glimpses of a woman Elias wished he could thank for the gift of these 2 souls. When the sky finally cleared on the 4th day, Elias took them outside into the pristine morning. The world had been remade in white, every branch weighted with snow, every surface glittering in the sun. "Time you learned about snares," he announced, leading them through the deep snow. "Can't live on beans forever." He showed them how to find rabbit runs beneath the snow, demonstrating the careful placement of wire and trigger. Daniel absorbed every detail, his hands quick to copy Elias's movements. Even Marybeth joined in, her small fingers surprisingly deft at shaping the wire. Looking at them in the bright morning light, Elias knew he should be planning their trip to town. The proper thing would be to find them a family, perhaps with the preacher's help. But watching Daniel concentrate on setting his first snare, seeing Marybeth's proud smile as she marked their trail with broken branches, Elias could not bear the thought of letting them go. These children had somehow worked their way into the empty spaces of his life, filling them with purpose he had never expected to find. Their trust in him felt like a gift he had done nothing to deserve, yet one he desperately wanted to honor. The morning stretched on as they checked the trapline together, 3 figures moving through the sparkling wilderness. Elias showed them how to read the snow for signs of game, their excited whispers carrying on the crystal air when they found fresh tracks. "Reckon that's enough for one morning," Elias finally said, noting their reddened cheeks and tired steps. "Time to head back." As they walked home, and when had his line shack become home? Mary Beth slipped her mittened hand into his. Daniel walked on his other side, matching his stride with determined steps. Together they made their way through the deep snow, leaving a single trail of footprints that led back to the waiting warmth of their cabin. The winter weeks passed slowly, marked by lengthening days and dwindling supplies. Elias watched their stores of dried meat and corn shrink, knowing they would soon need to make the journey down to the settlement. He had been dreading this moment, understanding what awaited them in town. One crisp morning, he checked their supplies one final time. "Can't put it off no longer," he announced, rolling up his empty flour sack. "Need to make a run to Patterson's store." Daniel looked up from mending a snare wire. "We'll help carry." Elias nodded, grateful for the boy's eagerness, but worried about what lay ahead. "It's a fair piece down the mountain. Best get an early start." They set out just after dawn, frost crackling under their boots. Elias led them down familiar hunting trails, showing them landmarks to remember. Mary Beth watched everything with bright eyes, asking names for trees and birds. Daniel walked beside their pack mule, one hand on its lead rope, determined to do his share. "Town's different from what you might remember," Elias warned as they descended. "Some folks, well, they ain't always kindly to those different from themselves." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Mary Beth moved closer to her brother, sensing his tension. The settlement appeared around midday, a cluster of wooden buildings hunched against the mountain shoulder. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the sound of hammering drifted up from the smithy. Elias led them down the muddy main street, aware of heads turning as they passed. "Half-breeds," came a whisper from the milliner's porch. "Boone's gone native," muttered another voice. Elias felt Daniel stiffen beside him. He placed a steady hand on the boy's shoulder, guiding him toward Patterson's general store. The bell above the door jangled as they entered. Inside, the store smelled of coffee beans and leather. Patterson stood behind his counter, his round face going flat when he saw them. A few other customers browsed the shelves, their conversations dying as Elias approached. "Need flour and salt," Elias said evenly. "Coffee, too, if you've got it." Patterson's eyes slid over the children. "Price has gone up since your last visit." "That's so." Elias kept his voice neutral, though anger stirred in his chest. "Funny how that happens just today." A man by the tobacco barrel spat a stream of brown juice, deliberately close to Daniel's boots. The boy flinched but held his ground, his small fists clenching at his sides. "Much obliged if you'd mind where you spit," Elias said, his tone carrying steel beneath its quiet surface. The man sneered. "Free country, I spit where I please." Elias felt the old rage rise, hot and familiar. His hand wanted to curl into a fist, to answer hatred with violence as he once would have. But he felt Mary Beth's fingers clutch his coat, saw Daniel watching him with worried eyes. "Reckon it is a free country," Elias replied slowly, "free enough for decent folks to shop in peace." He turned back to Patterson. "The flour and salt, if you please." Patterson named a price nearly double the usual rate. Elias paid without comment, though the injustice burned in his throat. He supervised as Daniel and Mary Beth loaded their supplies onto the mule, keeping himself between them and the townsfolk's stares. The ride home was quiet. Daniel sat stiffly in his saddle, shame and anger visible in every line of his small body. Mary Beth rode double with Elias, her face buried against his back. Evening found them back in their cabin, the new supplies stored away. Elias built up the fire, watching Daniel methodically splitting kindling with sharp, angry strokes. "Them folks in town," Elias began carefully, "they're speaking from ignorance and fear. Ain't nothing wrong with you or your sister." Daniel's axe bit deep into a piece of wood. "They hate us 'cause of what we are." "No." Elias moved to crouch beside him. "They hate what they don't understand. That's their burden to bear, not yours." Mary Beth joined them by the fire, her dark eyes serious. "Mama said God loves everyone the same." "Your mama was right." Elias reached for his Bible, running his thumb along its worn edges. "I've done plenty wrong in my life. Used to answer hatred with hatred, violence with violence. Took me years to learn that path leads nowhere good." He opened the Bible, finding a familiar passage. "Says here to love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Ain't easy. Lord knows it ain't easy. But it's the only way to find peace." Daniel looked up, his face troubled. What if they never change? "Then we show them a better way," Elias said firmly. "By living decent, treating others with respect even when they don't deserve it. That's true strength, son." The word slipped out naturally, and Elias saw both children react to it. Mary Beth's eyes filled with hope, while Daniel's shoulders straightened slightly. "I've been thinking," Elias continued, choosing his words carefully. "Reckon you both need a proper home, somewhere you can grow up safe and strong." He cleared his throat. "If you're willing, I'd like to make this official. Raise you as my own." Mary Beth launched herself into his arms, nearly knocking him backward. Daniel stayed where he was, but Elias saw tears gleaming in the boy's eyes. "You mean it?" Daniel asked, his voice rough. "Even with everyone in town?" "Especially because of them," Elias said firmly. "You're worth 10 of any man who'd judge a child for things they can't help. Both of you deserve a father who'll stand by you, no matter what comes." Daniel moved then, joining his sister in Elias's embrace. For a long moment they stayed that way, 3 hearts beating together in the firelit cabin. "Got something else to show you," Elias said finally, wiping his eyes. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Bought these in town today." Inside were 2 primer books, worn but serviceable. "Figure it's time you both learned your letters proper. Can't have my children growing up unable to read their own Bible." Mary Beth traced the letters on the cover with wondering fingers. Daniel held his book like it was made of gold, a slow smile spreading across his face. "We're really staying?" Mary Beth asked. "Forever?" "Forever," Elias confirmed. "This is your home now. We're family." Outside, snow began falling again, soft and steady. But inside their cabin, warmth bloomed that had nothing to do with the crackling fire. Elias looked at his children, and knew he had found his path to redemption. In their eyes, he saw not the violent man he had been, but the father he could become. Together they settled in to begin their first reading lesson, their shadows dancing on the cabin walls as the evening deepened into night. They were more than just a mountain man and 2 homeless kids now. They were family, bound together by choice and love stronger than any hatred the world might throw their way. Spring came to the mountains like a gentle awakening. Snow melted into crystal streams, and tender green buds appeared on the aspens. Elias watched Daniel stride confidently along their trapline, checking and resetting snares with practiced hands. At 14, the boy had grown tall and sure-footed, his shoulders broadening from honest work. "See here," Elias instructed, kneeling beside a fresh beaver track. "Water's still dripping in the print. He's close." Daniel nodded, studying the mark intently. "Reckon he's got a lodge upstream?" "Sharp eyes, son." Elias felt pride warm his chest. Let's follow his trail, see where he leads us. Back at the cabin, Mary Beth stood at the door, her dark hair caught in the morning breeze. At 12, she had her mother's grace, but there was steel beneath her gentle manner. She waved as they approached, the smell of cornbread drifting from the cabin. "Found Ma's recipe in your old journal," she announced proudly. "The one with wild honey." Elias smiled, remembering the careful notes his wife had penciled in the margins of his trapping journal years ago. "Smells just like she used to make." Inside, Mary Beth had laid out her morning's work. Dried herbs hung in neat bundles from the rafters, each labeled in her improving handwriting. She'd been studying the medicinal plants detailed in Elias's journals, asking endless questions about their uses. "Yarrow for bleeding," she recited, pointing to each bundle. "Willow bark for fever. Elderflower for coughs." "Good girl," Elias praised. "Knowledge like that's worth more than gold out here." The seasons turned like pages in a book. Summer brought long days of riding the fur trade routes, teaching Daniel and Mary Beth to read trail signs and weather patterns. Elias showed them how to smoke meat, tan hides, and find water in dry country. Every mile strengthened their bond. Every shared hardship drew them closer. "Bible says there's a time for everything under heaven," Elias said one evening, as they sat around their campfire. "Reckon there's a time for learning, too." He pulled out their worn primers, now supplemented with a proper arithmetic book and a second-hand copy of Pilgrim's Progress. The children had taken to reading with fierce determination, often practicing by firelight after long days on the trail. Winters were the hardest teacher. The winter of 1862 brought storms that howled like hungry wolves around their cabin. Food grew scarce, and they learned to make do with less. Daniel proved his worth, bringing down a deer through blinding snow when their stores ran low. "The Lord provides," Elias said that night as they bowed their heads over steaming bowls. His prayer was rough but sincere. "Thank you for this food and for the family to share it with." Mary Beth's sewing skills improved with each passing season. She patched their clothes with neat stitches, made quilts from old trading blankets, and even fashioned Daniel a new hunting shirt from deer hide. Her gentle hands worked healing too, tending cuts and bruises with herbs and quiet confidence. By 1865, change had worked its quiet miracle. Daniel, now a young man of 14, stood as tall as Elias. His hands were strong and sure with axe and rifle, his judgment sound on the trail. Mary Beth, 12, had grown into herself, teaching younger children their letters when families passed through, earning respect with her quiet wisdom. "Time to ride to town," Elias announced one clear spring morning. "Trading season's coming on." They rode in with heads high, no longer the frightened children of years past. Daniel sat his horse with easy grace, leading their pack mules. Mary Beth had dressed them all in clean, well-mended clothes, her own skirts neat and proper. The town had grown some, boasting a new church and schoolhouse. Folks still stared as they passed, but something had changed. Where once there had been open sneers, now there were thoughtful looks, even tentative nods of greeting. At the general store, now run by Patterson's son, Daniel handled their trading with quiet dignity. He knew the worth of their furs and drove a fair bargain, neither demanding nor accepting less than they deserved. "Fine pelts," the young storekeeper admitted, running practiced hands over their beaver skins. "Clean work." "Much obliged," Daniel replied evenly, his voice deep and steady. Mary Beth drew attention too, but not the cruel kind of years past. Women noticed her modest demeanor, her careful speech, the way she helped a toddler who had fallen in the street. The minister's wife even stopped to speak with her about herbs for her sick child. "Yarrow tea might help," Mary Beth offered softly, "with honey for the taste." Elias watched it all with quiet satisfaction. The years had worked their change, not just in the children but in him as well. The angry man who once dealt in violence had learned patience, found peace in teaching and nurturing. His prayers, once awkward and halting, now came from a heart full of gratitude. That evening, back in their cabin, Elias looked at his family with new eyes. Daniel sat cleaning his rifle, his movements sure and practiced. Mary Beth stirred their supper, humming an old hymn their mother had taught them. The cabin, once a lonely trapper's shelter, had become a true home. "Remember that first winter?" Daniel asked suddenly, looking up from his work. "When you found us?" "Clear as yesterday," Elias replied. "Two half-frozen little ones, scared as rabbits." "You could have left us," Mary Beth said quietly. "Most would have." "Never had a choice about that," Elias answered, his voice rough with feeling. "Lord put you in my path for a reason." "Reckon he did at that," Daniel agreed, and the look he gave Elias was purely a son's love for his father. They weren't the unwanted orphans anymore, marked by their mixed blood and others' prejudice. They were boon children now, shaped by mountain wisdom and a father's patient love. Their dignity spoke louder than any whispered slur. Their character shone brighter than any shadow of the past. As they bowed their heads for evening prayer, Elias felt the rightness of it all. The lonely years of his youth, the violence he had known, even the grief of losing his first family. All of it had led him here, to this moment, to these children who had become his own. "Thank you, Lord," he prayed, his voice steady and sure, "for the gift of family, and for showing an old mountain man the way home." The fire crackled warmly, casting their shadows on the cabin walls. Father and children, bound not by blood but by something stronger. The choice to love, to teach, to grow together through seasons of hardship and joy. The autumn wind rustled through golden leaves as Elias helped Daniel load the last trunk onto their wagon. The year was 1870, and change hung in the air as surely as the morning frost. Daniel, now a strapping young man of 19, stood tall beside the wagon, his shoulders broad from years of mountain work. "Reckon I've got everything," Daniel said, adjusting the leather straps. His voice had deepened over the years, carrying the quiet confidence Elias had always hoped to instill in him. Mary Beth emerged from their cabin, carrying a bundle wrapped in checkered cloth. "Fresh biscuits for the journey," she said, tucking them into Daniel's satchel. At 17, she had grown into a graceful young woman, her dark hair neatly braided, her manner gentle but sure. Elias felt his chest tighten as he watched them. The decision had come after months of discussion around their evening fire. Daniel had shown a natural talent for metal work, fixing their tools and tinkering with broken wagon parts. When word came that Morton's smithy in Preston's Creek needed an apprentice, it seemed like Providence opening a door. "Town's only 3 days' ride," Daniel reminded them, seeing the worry in their faces. "I'll be back to visit every chance I get." Elias nodded, swallowing hard. Best get moving if we aim to make Beaver Creek by nightfall. He climbed onto the wagon seat, his joints protesting more than they used to. Mary Beth settled beside him, while Daniel mounted his horse to ride alongside. The journey to Preston's Creek took them through familiar territory, past trap lines and hunting grounds, where they'd made memories over the years. Each mile marked another step toward Daniel's future, and Elias found himself telling old stories, as if to hold on to the past a little longer. "Remember that spring when you tried to catch a young elk bare-handed?" Elias chuckled, glancing at Daniel. "Near broke my arm for my trouble," Daniel grinned. "But I learned respect for wild things that day." They made camp each night, as they had hundreds of times before, but there was a bitter-sweet edge to their familiar routine. Mary Beth cooked their meals, Daniel tended the horses, and Elias read from his worn Bible by firelight. Each evening felt precious, like water cupped in weathered hands. Preston's Creek had grown since Elias last visited. New buildings lined the main street, and the sound of hammers and saws filled the air. The smithy stood at the edge of town, its forge smoke rising straight and black against the morning sky. Old Morton met them at the door, his leather apron scorched and his hands calloused from decades at the anvil. He sized Daniel up with experienced eyes. "Strong back, steady hands," Morton nodded approvingly. "We'll start you tomorrow at dawn. There's a room ready above the shop." While Daniel and Morton discussed terms, Mary Beth helped unload the wagon, arranging Daniel's few possessions in his new quarters. Elias stood in the doorway, watching his children work together one last time, their movements synchronized by years of shared tasks. "It's a good trade," Elias said later, as they shared a final meal at the town's small restaurant. "Honest work that folks will always need." "Learned that from you, Pa," Daniel replied quietly, "about doing work you can be proud of." The moment of parting came too soon. They stood outside the smithy in the gathering dusk, none of them quite ready to say goodbye. Mary Beth hugged her brother fiercely, pressing a small package into his hands. "Ma's hymnal," she whispered. "Found it in the old wagon years ago. Thought you should have it now." Daniel's eyes glistened as he tucked the book carefully into his shirt. Then he turned to Elias, who stood struggling to find words. "You saved us that night," Daniel said, his voice rough with emotion. "Gave us a home, taught us everything worth knowing. I aim to make you proud." Elias pulled him close, holding tight to the boy who had become a man under his care. "Already have, son. Already have." The wagon seemed lighter on the return journey, and not just from Daniel's absence. Elias felt the weight of years in his bones, noticed the silver threading through his beard when he caught his reflection in streams. But watching Mary Beth beside him, strong and capable, eased his heart. "Might be time I did something useful too," she said on their second evening home. "Town needs a teacher for the little ones. Minister mentioned it when we passed through." Elias studied her across their supper table. "You've got the learning for it," he agreed. "And the patience." And so their lives shifted again, like weather changing on the mountain. Mary Beth began teaching in Preston's Creek's one-room schoolhouse, riding in each morning on her mare. The children took to her quickly, drawn by her quiet strength and gentle ways. Even the parents who had once whispered about her Cherokee blood fell silent when their children came home, reading and ciphering. Daniel threw himself into his apprenticeship, learning to shape metal with the same dedication he'd once shown to mountain craft. His natural skill combined with Morton's teaching soon had him turning out work that drew praise from experienced hands. True to his word, Daniel visited often, riding out on Saturday afternoons with Mary Beth after her school week ended. They brought town news, fresh bread, and sometimes one of Mary Beth's berry pies. The cabin filled with talk and laughter, almost like old times. "Morton says I'm learning faster than he expected," Daniel reported one evening, showing them a finely made horseshoe. "Might have my own forge someday." "Children are reading whole chapters now," Mary Beth added, her face glowing. "Even little Tommy Carter, who everyone said was slow." Elias listened to their stories, pride warming him more than the fire. His joints ached more these days, and sometimes he had to rest after checking his trap lines. But watching his children grow into their own lives eased the sting of aging. One Sunday evening, as Daniel and Mary Beth prepared to ride back to town, Elias stood on his porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. The same mountains that had once seen him as an angry young man, that had witnessed his redemption through 2 abandoned children, now watched his silver years approach with grace. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered, his prayer carried on the evening wind, "for giving this old trapper more than he ever deserved." The children mounted their horses, promising to return the following weekend. Elias watched them ride away, their figures strong and straight in their saddles. They were no longer the frightened orphans he'd found in the snow, but they were still his, bound by something stronger than blood. As their hoofbeats faded into the gathering dusk, Elias smiled. Time might be catching him, but his legacy rode tall in the saddle, carried forward in the hearts and hands of the children who had become his greatest blessing. The year 1879 brought changes to the frontier like a storm rolling over distant hills. Cattle Baron Thomas Harrigan had been expanding his empire steadily across the territory, buying up lands and water rights with gold in one hand and threats in the other. His fancy boots and tailored suits couldn't hide the predator beneath, a man who saw the land only as something to possess. On a crisp autumn morning, Elias rode his familiar trail along Sweetwater Creek, checking his trap lines. The water gurgled clear and cool, vital to both Cherokee families and settlers who'd built homes nearby. He dismounted near the bend, kneeling to examine tracks in the mud. Something felt wrong. Too many horse prints for this quiet stretch, and boot marks that spoke of men trying not to be seen. A twig snapped behind him. Elias turned slowly, hands raised, to find 3 of Harrigan's riders watching him with hard eyes. "Mighty far from your cabin, old man," the lead rider said, fingers drumming on his holstered pistol. "Creek's free land," Elias answered evenly. "Always has been." "Not no more. Mr. Harrigan's got papers saying different. Best you spread the word to them Cherokee friends of yours. This water belongs to the ranch now." Elias stood his ground. "Water belongs to all who need it. Been that way since before any of us drew breath." The riders exchanged glances. "Shame if accidents started happening to folks who don't understand progress," the leader drawled. They wheeled their horses and rode off, leaving threat hanging heavy in the air like gun smoke. That evening, Elias wrote careful letters to both his children, describing the encounter. Daniel had built a solid reputation as Preston Creek's blacksmith, while Marybeth's school had grown to nearly 30 students. They needed to know trouble was stirring. But before his warnings could reach them, violence struck. 3 days later, a settler named James Morton, no relation to the blacksmith, was found dead near the disputed creek, a bullet in his back. Within hours, Harrigan's men spread word that Morton had argued with Elias about water rights the day before. Sheriff Kincaid arrived at Elias's cabin just after sunrise. The lawman's face was grave as he dismounted, followed by 2 deputies. "Got to take you in, Elias," Kincaid said, real regret in his voice. "Harrigan's men signed statements saying they saw you and Morton in a heated argument yesterday." "Because I warned him Harrigan's riders were making threats," Elias replied. But he knew it wouldn't matter. He allowed himself to be handcuffed, head held high as they led him to town. Word spread fast across the territory. Daniel was working the forge when a breathless neighbor brought news of his father's arrest. He dropped his hammer mid-stroke, the unfinished horseshoe forgotten as he ran for his horse. Marybeth heard while teaching her students their letters. She dismissed class immediately, gathering her skirts to hurry toward the jail. They found Elias in a cell barely big enough to stretch out in, his weathered face calm despite the iron bars. "It's Harrigan," Daniel growled, gripping the cell door until his knuckles went white. "He's behind this, trying to force folks off the creek." "We'll prove your innocence," Marybeth added, reaching through the bars to squeeze her father's hand. "The whole town knows you're not a killer." Elias managed a small smile. Truth has a way of coming out. Just got to trust in the Lord's timing. But as days passed, the situation darkened. Harrigan's influence ran deep. He'd bought judges, paid witnesses, and spread enough silver to make even honest men look away. The trial date was set for just 2 weeks away, suspiciously quick for such serious charges. Daniel worked his forge late into each night, using the rhythmic hammering to control his rage. During the day, he rode the countryside, searching for anyone who might have seen what really happened to Morton. Marybeth visited her father daily, bringing food and reading from his old Bible. She also listened carefully to town gossip, noting which folks seemed afraid to speak against Harrigan. Sheriff Kincaid watched it all with troubled eyes. He'd known Elias for years, respected him as a man of honor. But Harrigan's grip on the territory was tight, and crossing him meant risking not just his badge, but his life. One evening, as shadows lengthened across the jail floor, Kincaid brought Elias an extra blanket. "Talk in town's turning ugly," he said quietly. "Some folks calling for a hanging, stirred up by Harrigan's men. Watch yourself." Elias nodded, understanding the warning. He'd seen frontier justice before, knew how quickly a mob could form when fear and whiskey mixed. But his faith didn't waver. God hadn't led him through all these years to abandon him now. Daniel and Mary Beth met in the gathering dusk outside the jail, their faces drawn with worry. They'd heard the same whispers of hanging, seen the way some townspeople hurried past without meeting their eyes. "We need help," Mary Beth said softly. "Someone brave enough to stand against Harrigan." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Pa taught us that doing right matters more than being safe. We'll find a way, together." Inside his cell, Elias knelt in prayer as night fell. The same hands that had once dealt death now clasped in petition for justice. Through the small window, he could see stars appearing one by one, bright and steady as truth itself. Whatever came next, he knew his children would stand tall, the finest legacy a man could hope for. The charge of murder hung over the town like storm clouds, dark with the promise of violence to come. But in that moment, 3 hearts beat as one, a family bound not by blood but by choice, facing whatever tomorrow might bring with courage born of love. The Preston Creek jail stood quiet in the pale morning light. Inside his rough-hewn cell, Elias Boone sat straight-backed on the narrow cot, refusing to slouch or show weakness. The stone walls pressed close, so different from the open mountains he'd called home for decades. Yet his weathered face remained calm, his eyes clear and steady as he studied the worn Bible in his hands. Sheriff Kincaid approached the cell, keys jingling. "Brought you some breakfast, Elias. Ain't much, just beans and hardtack." "Much obliged," Elias said softly, accepting the tin plate through the bars. He'd known worse meals in his trapping days. Pride wouldn't let him complain now. Outside the jail, Daniel worked with fierce determination at his forge. The steady rhythm of hammer-striking anvil matched his heartbeat as he shaped metal for Mr. Peterson's plow. But his mind wasn't on the work. It was on the growing stack of documents hidden in his workshop. Land deeds, water rights, sale records, anything that might expose Harrigan's corrupt dealings. "Found something interesting this morning," his apprentice Tommy whispered, glancing around before pulling a folded paper from his vest. Copy of an old deed showing Sweetwater Creek was marked as common land. Harrigan's claim don't hold water, if you'll pardon the saying. Daniel's eyes lit up. "Good work, Tommy. Add it to the others." He'd been teaching the boy more than just smithing lately. Together they'd been carefully copying every suspicious document they could find, building their case piece by piece. Across town, Mary Beth Boone knocked on another door, her shoulders straight despite the weight of worried glances from passers-by. Sarah Wilson, one of the town's eldest residents, opened it cautiously. "Miss Boone," Sarah said, wringing her apron, "I've been expecting you might come." "Mrs. Wilson?" Mary Beth smiled gently. "I'm gathering stories about my father, times he's helped folks over the years. I remember him mentioning your name." Sarah glanced nervously up and down the street before ushering Mary Beth inside. In the dim parlor, she spoke in hushed tones about the winter of 1873 when her husband had just died. "We was near starving, me and the little ones. Your pa showed up one morning with 6 prime beaver pelts. Said he'd heard we was struggling." Sarah dabbed at her eyes. "Those pelts got us through that winter. Never asked nothing in return, neither." Mary Beth carefully recorded the story in her little notebook, adding it to dozens of similar tales. Each one revealed the true measure of the man now sitting behind bars. That afternoon, Circuit Preacher Thompson rode into town, his horse dusty from the trail. He found Mary Beth at the schoolhouse after classes. "Heard about your father?" he said gravely. "Came as soon as I could. That winter you mentioned, 1873, I remember it clear as yesterday. Elias brought pelts for 3 other widows besides Sarah Wilson. Said it was the Lord's work, helping them as needed it." "Would you testify to that, preacher?" Marybeth asked, hopefully. Thompson's face hardened. I surely would. Seen too many good men brought low by Harrigan's schemes. Time somebody took a stand. Meanwhile, Daniel rode out to the Cherokee settlements, where many remembered Elias from his trapping days. Elder Walking Deer received him with dignity, sharing pipe smoke as custom required before speaking of serious matters. Your father, the elder said in careful English. He showed respect when others showed scorn. Many winters passed, my grandson fell sick with fever. Nearest doctor refused to come. Elias carried the boy through snow to town, stayed 3 days until the fever broke. He touched the medicine pouch at his neck. We remember such kindness. But not everyone was willing to speak. Daniel lost count of the doors that closed in his face, the conversations that stopped when he approached. Harrigan's influence cast a long shadow, and fear had deep roots. When visiting hours came, Daniel and Marybeth met at the jail, sharing what they'd learned. Elias listened quietly to their reports, pride and worry warring in his eyes. You're both working too hard, he said finally. If things go badly... Don't, Daniel cut him off, gripping the cell bars. We won't let them hang you for something you didn't do. The truth will come out, Marybeth added firmly. We've gathered so many testimonies. Testimonies won't matter if Harrigan's bought the judge, Elias replied softly. You need to be prepared. If the worst happens, I want you both to leave this territory. Start fresh somewhere else. No. Marybeth's voice was steel wrapped in silk. We're not children anymore, Pa. You taught us to stand for what's right, no matter the cost. And you taught us family sticks together, Daniel added. We're not letting go. Elias closed his eyes briefly, touched and troubled by their devotion. When he opened them again, they shone with unshed tears. You've grown into fine people, he said roughly. Finer than I deserved, taking you in all those years ago. You're wrong about that, Marybeth smiled, reaching through the bars to squeeze his hand. God knew exactly what he was doing that night in the snow. They stayed until Sheriff Kincaid reluctantly announced visiting hours were over. As they walked out into the gathering dusk, Daniel and Marybeth exchanged determined looks. Tomorrow would bring more doors to knock on, more records to search, more battles to fight. But they would face it together, just as they had every challenge since that long-ago winter night when a gruff mountain man had opened his heart to 2 lost children. Behind them in his cell, Elias knelt for his evening prayers. Outside his window, a meadowlark sang its evening song, sweet and clear as hope itself. He prayed not for himself, but for his children, that their faith would stay strong, their hearts pure, no matter what justice or injustice might come. Sheriff Kincaid made his final rounds, pausing at Elias's cell. The old lawman's face was troubled as he watched his prisoner pray. He'd known Elias Boone for 20 years, seen him change from a solitary trapper to a devoted father. The thought of hanging such a man based on Harrigan's lies sat like poison in his gut. But speaking out meant risking not just his badge, but the lives of his own family. The weight of that choice pressed heavy on his shoulders as he continued his rounds, keys jingling softly in the gathering dark. The courthouse stood silent in the crisp morning air as townspeople filed inside. Dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight streaming through tall windows, settling on worn wooden benches packed with spectators. The trial of Elias Boone had drawn nearly every soul in the territory. Daniel and Marybeth sat directly behind their father, who remained straight-backed in his chair despite weeks in the jail cell. His hands, rough from decades of mountain life, rested quietly on the table before him. Across the aisle, Harrigan lounged in the front row, his expensive suit a stark contrast to Elias's simple clothes. A satisfied smirk played at the corners of his mouth as he whispered to his lawyer, Jerome Phillips. Judge Matthews entered, his black robes sweeping behind him. Court is now in session, the bailiff announced, voice echoing off the high ceiling. The territory versus Elias Boone on the charge of murder in the 1st degree. Phillips rose smoothly, adjusting his silk vest. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice oiled and practiced. "The evidence will show that Elias Boone is nothing more than a violent hermit, a man who shuns decent society in favor of the wild. When honest settler Thomas Reed attempted to water his cattle at Sweetwater Creek, Boone murdered him in cold blood." Daniel's hands clenched into fists as Phillips continued spinning his web of lies. The prosecutor described Elias as a dangerous recluse, with a history of violence, a threat to civilization itself. Behind him, Mary Beth touched his arm gently, reminding him to stay calm. "The prosecution calls Sheriff Kincaid," Phillips announced. The sheriff took the stand, looking uncomfortable as Phillips questioned him about finding Reed's body. "Shot clean through the heart," Kincaid testified, avoiding Elias's steady gaze. "Found boot prints leading back toward Boone's property." When it was the defense's turn, Elias's lawyer, Samuel Warren, approached the stand. "Sheriff, in 20 years of knowing the defendant, have you ever known him to be violent?" Kincaid shifted in his seat. "No, sir, can't say as I have." "And these boot prints? Could they have belonged to anyone?" "Well, yes. Weren't nothing special about them." As the morning wore on, Phillips called witness after witness, each painting Elias as a dangerous outsider. But Warren was ready with his own witnesses. First came Reverend Thompson, the circuit preacher. "Elias Boone has been a blessing to this community," Thompson declared firmly. "In the harsh winter of 1873, he donated prime pelts to 4 widows, asking nothing in return. Said it was the Lord's work." Sarah Wilson testified next, her voice quavering but clear. "My children and I would have starved that winter, if not for Mr. Boone's kindness. He's a good Christian man who helps those in need." Then it was Daniel's turn. He stood tall in his blacksmith's apron, speaking with quiet conviction. "My sister and I were orphans, half frozen in the snow. Most men would have left us to die. But our father, Elias Boone, he carried us to safety, raised us to be honest, hard-working folks." His voice grew stronger. "He taught us that mercy matters more than hatred, that every soul deserves respect." Harrigan's smirk had faded as the testimony continued. He leaned forward, whispering urgently to Phillips. Mary Beth took the stand next, her simple schoolteacher's dress a testament to the life Elias's care had made possible. "Our father is a man of deep faith," she said clearly. "He reads his Bible every night, leads grace at meals. The children I teach, both settler and Cherokee, know him as someone who helps anyone in trouble." Phillips tried to shake her testimony on cross-examination. "Isn't it true your father avoids town, preferring to live alone in the wilderness?" "He prefers the peace of God's creation," Mary Beth replied calmly. "But he's never turned away anyone in need." The afternoon sun slanted lower through the windows when Warren called his final witness. A hushed murmur swept through the courthouse as Gray Elk entered. The Cherokee elder walked with dignity to the witness stand, his silver hair and lined face speaking of hard-earned wisdom. "I speak truth here today," Gray Elk began in clear English, "about the man you call Elias Boone. Many winters ago, my niece lay dying of fever. No doctor would come to Cherokee land. This man carried her through deep snow to town, stayed 3 days until she lived." He touched the medicine pouch at his neck. "Our people remember such kindness. We count him as friend." Phillips rose to object. "Your Honor, this testimony is irrelevant to the murder charge." "It speaks directly to the defendant's character," Warren countered. "The prosecution has tried to paint him as violent and dangerous. The jury deserves to hear the truth." "Overruled," Judge Matthews declared. "Continue, sir." Gray Elk's steady gaze swept the courtroom. "I have watched this man teach his children respect for all people. He stops at our villages to trade fairly, speaks our language with honor. When others steal our water, he shares his springs. This is not the way of a murderer." In the stunned silence that followed, Elias bowed his head. His lips moved in silent prayer, gratitude shining in his eyes as he looked at the children who had worked so hard to defend him. The afternoon light caught the tears on Mary Beth's cheeks. Harrigan's face had darkened to a thunderous scowl. He grabbed Phillips's arm, whispering furiously. But something had shifted in the courtroom. The spectators who had come expecting entertainment now sat thoughtful and grave, moved by the parade of witnesses speaking to one man's quiet decency. "The defense rests, Your Honor," Warren announced. Judge Matthews nodded. "We'll hear closing arguments in the morning. Court is adjourned." As the bailiff led Elias back toward his cell, Daniel and Mary Beth pressed close to the railing. "You done good, kids," he said softly. "Real good." "We're not finished yet, Pa," Daniel replied firmly. "The truth is on our side," Mary Beth added. "God won't let evil triumph." They watched him go, backs straight with determination. The testimony had given them hope, but tomorrow would bring the final battle. As the courthouse emptied, Harrigan stormed out, his boot heels striking angry sparks from the wooden floor. But he no longer looked quite so confident of his victory. The evening sun painted the courthouse windows gold as Daniel and Mary Beth walked home, arms linked in shared strength. They had spoken truth to power today. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring, but they faced it together, just as Elias had taught them. The morning sun cast long shadows through the courthouse windows as the jury filed back in after their recess. Daniel sat rigid beside Mary Beth, his jaw clenched tight. The previous day's testimonies had kindled hope, but something felt wrong. He had seen Harrigan slip away during the break, followed shortly by Judge Blackwell. The judge's face was stone cold as he adjusted his robes and cleared his throat. "Before we proceed with closing arguments, the court has several matters to address." He shuffled through some papers, then looked up with hard eyes. "Upon review, I am striking all testimony given by Cherokee witnesses as inadmissible in this territorial court." A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd. Mary Beth gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. In the front row, Harrigan's lips curled in a satisfied smile. "Your Honor," Samuel Warren shot to his feet. "Gray Elk's testimony is vital to establishing my client's character. You yourself ruled it admissible yesterday." "The court has reconsidered its position," Blackwell replied flatly. "Furthermore, I am excluding the land deed records Mr. Boone's son attempted to enter as evidence, as they are, irrelevant to the murder charge." Daniel's blood ran cold. Those records had shown Harrigan's pattern of seizing water rights through violence and intimidation. He had spent weeks gathering them, proving the cattle baron's corruption. "This is an outrage," Warren protested. "These documents establish clear motive for framing my client." Judge Blackwell's gavel cracked like a gunshot. "One more outburst, Mr. Warren, and I'll hold you in contempt. Proceed with closing arguments." Jerome Phillips rose smoothly, straightening his expensive vest. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "The facts are clear. An honest settler lies dead. The defendant, a known recluse with a violent past, was seen in the area. Boot prints led to his property. The choice before you is simple. Will you let a murderer walk free?" Warren did his best in his closing argument, highlighting Elias's decades of quiet decency and the complete lack of direct evidence. But with the Cherokee testimony and land records suppressed, his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. "How do you find?" Judge Blackwell intoned. The foreman stood, a man Daniel recognized as one of Harrigan's ranch hands. "We find the defendant, Elias Boone, guilty of murder in the first degree." The words struck like physical blows. Mary Beth swayed in her seat, tears streaming down her face. Daniel reached for her hand, squeezing it hard enough to hurt. Elias sat perfectly still, his weathered face betraying no emotion. Only his eyes, fixed on his children, showed the pain and fear he felt. "Elias Boone," Judge Blackwell pronounced, "this court sentences you to death by hanging, to be carried out at dawn 3 days hence." His gavel fell with terrible finality. Court is adjourned. A cheer went up from the back of the room, where Harrigan's men had gathered. They began to whoop and stamp their feet, drowning out Marybeth's sob. Something snapped inside Daniel. With a roar, he lunged toward the sheriff who was moving to take Elias away. "You can't do this!" he shouted. "It's all lies!" "Daniel, no!" Marybeth cried. Two deputies grabbed his arms, wrestling him back as Sheriff Kincaid led Elias toward the door. The older man's steps were steady, his head held high despite the chains at his wrists. "Let me go!" Daniel struggled against the deputy's grip. "Pa!" Elias turned at his son's cry. "Be still, boy," he said quietly. "No good comes of fighting now." "Listen to your father," Sheriff Kincaid said, genuine regret in his voice. "Don't make this harder." Marybeth pushed through the crowd, her face tear-streaked but determined. "Your Honor, please," she pleaded, reaching toward the judge's bench. "You know this isn't right. You know what Harrigan's done." Judge Blackwell wouldn't meet her eyes. "Remove these people from my courtroom," he ordered coldly. As the deputies dragged them toward the door, Harrigan stepped into their path. "Better accept it, half-breeds," he sneered. "Your murdering papa's going to swing?" Daniel lunged at him, but the deputy's grip held firm. Marybeth grabbed her brother's arm. "Not now," she whispered. "Pa needs us." They were pushed out onto the courthouse steps, where a crowd had gathered to hear the verdict. More cheers went up as word spread. Daniel felt sick at the bloodthirsty joy in their faces. "The Lord's justice!" someone shouted. "Hang the killer!" called another. Samuel Warren joined them outside, his face grave. "I'm sorry," he said. "With the evidence suppressed, I'll file an appeal, but with only 3 days." "There has to be something we can do," Marybeth insisted. "I'll keep trying," Warren promised. "But you should. Prepare yourselves." They were allowed to visit Elias in his cell that evening. The sheriff gave them privacy, standing well back from the iron bars. "Pa," Marybeth whispered, reaching through to touch his hand. "We'll find a way. We won't let this happen." Elias managed a gentle smile. "You both fought so hard. I'm proud of you. But maybe this is God's will." "Don't talk like that," Daniel growled. "This ain't God's will. It's Harrigan's evil." "The Lord works in mysterious ways, son." Elias's voice was steady, though his eyes betrayed his fear. "I've lived a long life, done things I ain't proud of. But raising you two, that was my redemption." "You're innocent," Marybeth protested. "We can't just—" "Listen to me now," Elias cut her off gently. "I'm ready to meet my maker. What matters is that you two stay strong. Don't let hatred poison your hearts." Daniel slammed his fist against the wall. "They're murdering you. How can we not hate them?" "Because hate's what brought us here," Elias replied. "Harrigan's hate for the Cherokee, the town's hate for anyone different. We got to be better than that." Tears rolled down Marybeth's cheeks. "I don't want to lose you, Pa." "You won't ever lose me, girl." Elias pressed his forehead against the bars, close to his daughter's. "I'll be watching over you from above." "Time's up," Sheriff Kincaid called softly. Daniel gripped his father's hand hard. "This ain't over," he promised fiercely. Elias nodded slowly. "Whatever happens, remember I love you both. You're the best things I ever did in this world." They walked home through the gathering dusk, supporting each other. Neither spoke of the scaffold already being built in the town square, its rough beams stark against the sunset sky. 3 days, 72 hours to save their father's life. In his cell, Elias knelt in prayer, asking not for his life, but for strength to face what was coming, and for his children to find peace, whatever tomorrow might bring. The sound of hammering echoed through the night as Harrigan's men worked by torchlight, building the gallows that would see their master's will done. The night settled cold and heavy over the town, Stars pricked through gathering clouds as Daniel and Mary Beth huddled on the wooden bench outside the jailhouse. Neither spoke. What words could ease such pain? The steady thud of hammers from the town square marked each precious second slipping away. Inside his cell, Elias knelt on the rough planks. His voice carried softly through the barred window, steady in prayer. "Lord, I ain't always lived right," he murmured. "Made plenty of mistakes. But you blessed me beyond measure when you put them children in my path that winter night." He paused, drawing a shaky breath. "Thank you for letting me raise them. Thank you for showing me what it means to be a father." Daniel's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Every word drove daggers through his heart. Mary Beth reached for him, but he jerked away, pacing like a caged animal. Sheriff Kincaid stood in the shadows by his desk, head bowed. The old lawman's face was etched with troubled lines. "Sheriff," Elias said quietly, "need to tell you something?" Kincaid moved closer to the cell. "What's that, Boone?" "Don't carry no bitterness about this." Elias's voice was clear and firm. "You're doing what the law requires. I got no regrets about the life I lived, not since them kids came to me." The sheriff's shoulders slumped. "Wish it hadn't come to this, Elias. You're a good man." "Ain't always been good," Elias replied, "but the Lord gave me a chance to do right by them two. That's more blessing than I deserved." Daniel couldn't bear another word. He spun away from the window, boots thundering on the boardwalk as he strode into the darkness. "Daniel!" Mary Beth called after him. "Gotta find something?" he shouted back. "Gotta be proof somewhere?" She watched him vanish around the corner, knowing he would search until dawn. Her brother's determination had always burned hot as his forge fire. But tonight, she feared it would only bring him more pain. Turning back to the window, Mary Beth settled onto the bench. The hymn rose unbidden to her lips, the one their mother had sung in quiet moments, the one Elias had listened to them whisper that first storm-racked night in his cabin. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound! Her voice trembled, but grew stronger with each word. That saved a wretch like me. Inside the cell, Elias went still. The prayer died on his lips as his daughter's song floated through the bars. 20 years fell away in an instant. He saw them again, 2 small, frozen children huddled by his hearth, whispering their mother's hymn through chattering teeth. "I once was lost, but now am found," Mary Beth's clear voice carried on the night air. "Was blind, but now I see." Tears slid down Elias's weathered cheeks. He had thought himself cursed back then, a violent man forced into solitude by his own demons. The children had seemed a burden, a divine punishment for his sins. How wrong he had been. "Through many dangers, toils, and snares," Mary Beth sang softly, "I have already come. 'Tis grace has brought me safe thus far." Elias's deep voice joined hers, rough with emotion. "And grace will lead me home." Sheriff Kincaid turned away, blinking hard. He had seen countless men face the gallows in his years wearing the badge. Some raged, some wept, some faced it with stony silence. But he had never seen such peace, such pure love between father and child. The hymn faded into silence. Elias wiped his eyes with a shaking hand. "Mary Beth," he called softly through the window. "I'm here, Pa." "Remember that night you and Daniel first came to my cabin?" "Every detail," she answered. "You wrapped us in your buffalo coat, fed us the last of your venison." Elias nodded, though she couldn't see him. "I was angry at first, thought the Lord was punishing me, sending 2 helpless souls when I could barely keep myself alive." He drew a ragged breath. "But you know what? That night saved me. Your love, your trust, it washed away the darkness in my heart, made me want to be worthy of calling myself your Pa." "You are worthy," Mary Beth whispered fiercely. "You're the best father anyone could ask for." "I was lost before you came," Elias continued, "living with ghosts and regrets. But you two small lives gave me purpose, showed me what really matters. His voice caught. If this is my last night on Earth, I want you to know, taking you in was the finest thing I ever did. The joy you brought me. It was worth everything. Marybeth pressed her hand against the rough wall, as if she could reach through stone and iron to touch him. We'll find a way, Pa. Daniel won't give up. I won't give up. I know you won't, girl. Pride and love filled his words. You both got more strength than you know. Whatever happens, hold on to that strength. Hold on to each other. They fell silent then, father and daughter sharing the night's vigil. The hammering in the square had stopped, leaving only cricket song and the whisper of wind. Somewhere in the darkness, Daniel searched desperately for salvation. But here, in this moment of quiet communion, grace flowed between iron bars like living water, washing away fear and leaving behind the pure gold of love. Elias settled onto his thin mattress, peace stealing over him despite tomorrow's shadow. The curse he had feared had been a blessing in disguise, 2 small lives that gave his own meaning. Whatever dawn might bring, that gift could never be taken away. Through the window, Marybeth began to hum their hymn again, soft and sweet in the darkness. Her father closed his eyes, letting the melody carry him back through 20 years of memories, first steps and scraped knees, lessons learned and love freely given. No, he thought, no man could call himself cursed who had known such joy. The moon hung like a silver dollar behind thin clouds as Daniel crouched in the shadows of Harrigan's sprawling ranch house. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his hands remained steady. A blacksmith's hands, used to precision even under pressure. The main house loomed before him, dark except for a single lamp burning in an upstairs window. He had watched Harrigan's ranch hands drift off to their bunks one by one until only the night guard remained, making his slow rounds with a lantern. Daniel counted the man's steps, timing them. 15 paces to the corner, pause, turn, 15 more. Like clockwork. When the guard rounded the far corner, Daniel darted across the yard, boots silent in the dirt. The back door's lock was simple. He had repaired enough like it in his shop. With trembling fingers, he worked a thin piece of metal into the mechanism. 1 twist, 2, and it clicked open. The kitchen smelled of coffee and tobacco. Moonlight filtered through curtained windows, casting strange shadows across the floor. Daniel moved like a ghost, avoiding the creaky boards he had noticed while shoeing horses here last month. Harrigan's office lay at the end of the hall. This door's lock proved more challenging. Sweat beaded on Daniel's forehead as he worked at it, ears straining for any sound. Finally, it yielded with a soft snap. He slipped inside, easing the door closed behind him. The office reeked of leather and cigar smoke. Fine furniture crowded the space, a massive desk, leather chairs, cabinets filled with ledgers. Daniel's fingers brushed the desk's polished surface, remembering how Harrigan had sat here just days ago, smirking as he testified against Elias. "Where would you hide them?" Daniel whispered to himself. He had to work fast. The guard would pass the front windows soon. The desk drawers held only business papers, cattle sales, supply orders, wage records. Daniel moved to the cabinets, scanning quickly by moonlight. His heart sank as minutes ticked by with nothing to show for it. Then his eyes caught on something odd, a slight gap between the back of one drawer and the cabinet wall. He reached in, fingers finding a hidden catch. The false back swung open. Inside lay a stack of papers, yellow with age. Daniel's hands shook as he lifted them out. Land deeds, their signatures blotchy and uncertain. Letters between Harrigan and Judge Blackwell, discussing payments and favorable rulings. His eyes widened as he read dates, amounts, details of their corruption laid bare in ink and paper. Bootsteps creaked on the porch outside. Daniel froze, clutching the documents to his chest. The night guard's lantern cast moving shadows through the window. He dropped to the floor, crawling behind the desk as light swept across the room. The steps continued past. Daniel let out a shaky breath, tucking the papers carefully inside his coat. He had what he needed, proof of years of corruption, of Harrigan's ruthless land grabs and Blackwell's betrayal of justice. But as he rose to leave, voices drifted through the wall. Harrigan himself, still awake and moving through the house. Daniel's heart lurched. He couldn't go back through the hallway now. The window. He worked it open inch by inch, wincing at every tiny scrape. Cool night air brushed his face as he eased out onto the narrow ledge. The ground lay 15 feet below, hard-packed earth that would show no mercy if he fell. More voices inside. Footsteps approaching the office. Daniel edged along the ledge, fingers gripping the rough wood. Just a few more feet to the corner, where a drain pipe might offer a way down. The office door opened. Light spilled out the window behind him. Daniel pressed himself flat against the wall, hardly daring to breathe. Harrigan's voice carried clearly now. "Those deeds need to be registered first thing tomorrow. Once Boone hangs, there'll be no one left to challenge our claim to the springs." Daniel's fingers dug into the wood, rage burning in his chest. The papers crinkled inside his coat, precious evidence of the cattle baron's evil. "What about his Indian brats?" another voice asked. "They won't let it rest." Harrigan laughed, a cold sound. "They'll learn their place, same as the rest. No one crosses me in this territory." The drain pipe was just within reach. Daniel stretched out one hand, grabbed it. The metal creaked softly. Inside, the voices paused. "Did you hear something?" "Check outside." Daniel didn't wait. He swung onto the pipe, sliding down as quietly as he could. His boots hit dirt just as lantern light swept the corner. He dove into the shadows of the barn, heart pounding. Voices called out. Boots thundered on the porch. Daniel scrambled into the hayloft as men spilled into the yard with lanterns held high. He burrowed deep into the sweet-smelling hay, hardly daring to breathe as light and voices searched below. "Nothing here, boss." "Check the corrals. Could be rustlers." Daniel lay still as stone as the search continued. The papers pressed against his chest like fire. Hours crept by, marked only by his racing pulse and the slow wheel of stars through the hayloft window. Finally, false dawn began to pale the sky. The ranch grew quiet again, hands drifting back to their bunks before the day's work. Daniel waited until full light before slipping down from his hiding place. His horse waited where he had left her, hidden in a stand of cottonwoods. She nickered softly as he approached. "Easy, girl," he whispered, checking her tack with trembling fingers. "Let's get these papers to town." Meanwhile, Mary Beth had not been idle. While Daniel searched Harrigan's ranch, she moved through town like a quiet flame, kindling courage in hearts that had been frozen by fear. She started with the Reverend Thompson, who had always shown kindness to their family. The old preacher listened gravely as she spoke of justice and mercy, of her father's goodness and Harrigan's cruelty. "The Lord calls us to stand against evil," Thompson said finally, rising from his chair. "I'll speak to my congregation. Many have stayed silent too long." From there, Mary Beth visited Sarah Collins, who taught at the other schoolhouse. "Remember when Pa brought you medicine last winter?" she asked. "When your baby was sick and the doctor was snowbound?" Sarah nodded slowly. "He rode 3 days through the storm, never asked for payment." "Will you speak for him now?" "I will," Sarah whispered. "My husband, too. We've been afraid, but enough is enough." As dawn broke over the mountains, Mary Beth knocked on more doors. The general store owner, the telegraph operator, mothers whose children she taught, Cherokee families who had known Elias's fairness over the years. One by one, they gathered courage. Promises were made. Support grew like a slow tide. By the time the sun cleared the peaks, a small crowd had begun to form in the street outside the jail. "We're here for Elias," they told the sheriff. "We aim to see justice done." Mary Beth's heart swelled as she watched them arrive, merchants and farmers, settlers and Cherokee, preachers and teachers and common folk. The wall of fear Harrigan had built was crumbling, stone by stone. Then she saw Daniel galloping into town, his horse lathered with effort. Hope blazed in his eyes as he swung down, clutching a packet of papers to his chest. "Found it," he gasped, hurrying to her side. "Found the proof. Harrigan's been bribing Blackwell for years. Got it all right here." Marybeth gripped his arm, tears springing to her eyes. "The townsfolk are with us now," she said. "They're ready to stand up to Harrigan." Brother and sister shared a moment of fierce joy. The night's desperate work had borne fruit. Now they had both evidence and witnesses, a chance to save their father's life. But time was short. The sun climbed higher, marking the hours until dawn would bring the hangman's noose. They had to move quickly if truth was to overcome corruption, if justice was to prevail over greed. Daniel squared his shoulders, the precious papers secure in his coat. Marybeth lifted her chin, surveying their growing army of supporters. Together they turned toward the courthouse, ready to fight for the man who had given them everything. Dawn broke cold and gray over the town square. Mist clung to the wooden gallows that stood like a dark skeleton against the pale sky. The platform, hastily constructed the night before, smelled of fresh-cut pine and creaked softly in the morning breeze. Sheriff Kincaid stood at the base of the steps, his weathered face drawn with fatigue and something deeper, a shadow of doubt that wouldn't leave his eyes. He checked his pocket watch for the third time, its brass case catching the weak light. 7 o'clock, he muttered. Time to fetch the prisoner. The crowd began gathering early, drifting in from side streets and alleyways. Shopkeepers opened their doors slowly, as if reluctant to face the day. Women in dark shawls huddled together, whispering prayers. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, sensing the heavy mood that hung over the square like the morning fog. In his cell, Elias Boone sat on the narrow cot, his Bible open on his knee. His silver hair was neatly combed, his clothes clean and pressed, Marybeth's doing when she'd visited the night before. His weathered hands, steady despite everything, traced the familiar words on the page. The cell door creaked open. Sheriff Kincaid stood there, keys jangling softly. "It's time, Elias." Elias closed his Bible gently, rising with dignity despite his shackles. "Much obliged for your kindness these past days, Sheriff." Kincaid's jaw tightened. "Just doing my duty." "A man can do his duty and still show mercy," Elias said quietly. "You've done both." They walked slowly through the jail, their footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. Outside, the crowd had grown larger. The morning air carried the murmur of hundreds of voices, some angry, some fearful, all waiting. At the edge of the crowd, Daniel pushed through the press of bodies, the stolen documents clutched tight against his chest. Sweat dampened his shirt despite the cool morning. Marybeth kept close behind him, her face pale but determined. "Make way!" Daniel called out. "We have proof." The trial was fixed. A few heads turned, but his voice was lost in the general noise. The siblings fought their way forward as Elias appeared between two deputies, moving steadily toward the gallows steps. Gray Elk stood near the platform, his dignified presence drawing stares from the settlers around him. Other Cherokee elders had joined him, their faces grave as they watched their friend mount the steps. Elias's boots sounded hollow on the wooden stairs. Each step seemed to echo across the square. The hangman waited above, rope in hand, his face hidden beneath a black hood. "Pa!" Marybeth's cry cut through the morning air. "Daniel has the proof. Please, someone listen." More people turned now. Daniel thrust the papers above his head. "These are Harrigan's own documents! Forged deeds, letters proving he bribed Judge Blackwell." Near the platform, Harrigan's face darkened. He gestured sharply to his men. "Stop that foolishness! The law has spoken." But Gray Elk's deep voice rose above the commotion. "The law speaks with a forked tongue when gold fills its mouth. These children speak truth. I have seen Harrigan's men drive our people from the springs with threats and bullets." The crowd stirred uneasily. Whispers spread like ripples in a pond. On the platform, Sheriff Kincaid paused, his hand on the noose. Daniel seized the moment, his voice ringing out clear and strong. "Listen, here's a letter in Harrigan's own hand promising Blackwell $500 to rule against any Cherokee claims." He began to read, the damning words carrying across the square. Mary Beth pushed closer to the gallows. "You all know our pa. 20 years he's lived among you, helping any who needed it. Ask Widow Collins about the medicine he brought through the blizzard. Ask Reverend Thompson about the pelts he donated for the poor." "It's true!" Sarah Collins stepped forward from the crowd, her baby in her arms. "My child would have died if not for Elias Boone." More voices joined in, a chorus of testimony rising from the gathered townsfolk. "He helped rebuild my barn after the fire. Taught my boy to hunt when I was laid up with fever. Never turned away a hungry man from his door." The hangman looked uncertainly toward Sheriff Kincaid. The noose swayed empty in the morning breeze. Harrigan shouldered through the crowd, his face purple with rage. "This is nonsense. The man's a murderer. Hang him and be done." But Daniel held the evidence higher. "Here's proof the murdered man was Harrigan's own hired gun, sent to drive off Cherokee families. The killing was self-defense." Gray Elk stepped onto the first stair of the gallows. "I stand witness. The dead man shot first, aiming to kill. Elias Boone protected our children who were gathering water. This was no murder. It was the act of a righteous man defending the innocent." The crowd pressed closer to the platform. Faces that had been hostile now showed uncertainty, then determination. The mood shifted like wind before a storm. "Let him go," someone shouted. "Read the papers." "Justice for Boone!" The cry was taken up by more voices, swelling until it filled the square. Sheriff Kincaid looked out over the sea of faces, settlers and Cherokee, rich and poor, all united in their demand for truth. Elias stood quietly through it all, his eyes fixed on his children. Pride and love shone in his weathered face as he watched them fight for justice, not with guns or fists, but with courage and truth. Mary Beth reached the platform steps, tears streaming down her face. "Please, Sheriff Kincaid, you know in your heart this isn't right." The sheriff's hand fell away from the noose. He turned to face the crowd, his voice carrying across the sudden hush. "As an officer of the law, I cannot ignore evidence of corruption in our court." He pulled out his keys, moving toward Elias. "This execution is stayed until a full investigation can be conducted." A cheer went up from the crowd. Daniel and Mary Beth rushed up the steps as Kincaid unlocked their father's shackles. They threw their arms around him, holding tight as if they'd never let go. Harrigan's shout cut through the celebration. "This is outrageous! I'll have your badge for this, Kincaid." But the cattle baron's words fell on deaf ears. The townspeople had found their voices at last, their fear of his power broken by the courage of 2 devoted children and the quiet dignity of a reformed mountain man. Gray Elk laid his hand on Elias's shoulder as the family embraced. "The truth has many friends," he said softly, "when good hearts dare to speak it." The morning sun broke through the clouds then, touching the empty gallows with golden light. The noose cast no shadow on the platform where a family stood reunited, surrounded by neighbors who had chosen justice over fear, mercy over vengeance. Sheriff Kincaid's hands trembled on the keyring as the crowd's thunderous voice shook the wooden platform beneath their feet. Morning sunlight glinted off his badge as he looked from the papers in Daniel's grip to Elias's weathered face, then out at the sea of determined faces below. "I reckon," the sheriff's voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again, louder this time. "I reckon we've all been blind to some hard truths." The key slid into Elias's shackles with a metallic click that seemed to echo across the suddenly hushed square. The iron fell away, clanking against the rough boards. At the edge of the crowd, Judge Blackwell's face had gone pale as parchment. The man who had sat so proudly on his bench now looked small and frightened. His eyes darted left and right like a cornered rabbit's before he turned and began shoving his way through the press of bodies. "The judge is running!" someone shouted. "Stop him!" But there was no need. As Blackwell burst free of the crowd, the thunder of hoofbeats filled the morning air. A rider on a lathered horse came pounding down the main street, dust billowing in his wake. The silver star on his chest caught the sun as he reined up hard at the edge of the square. "United States Marshal," the rider's voice carried clear and strong. "What's all this commotion?" Daniel strode to the edge of the platform, holding the damning papers high. "Sir, we have evidence of corruption and false testimony. My father was wrongly convicted through bribes and lies." The marshal's keen eyes took in the scene. The empty noose swaying in the breeze, Elias standing unshackled, Harrigan's men fingering their gun belts nervously at the edge of the crowd. He swung down from his horse with fluid grace, spurs jingling as his boots hit dirt. "Bring me those documents, son." Daniel fairly flew down the gallows steps, Mary Beth close behind him. They reached the marshal just as Judge Blackwell tried to slink past, heading for the alley beside the general store. "And where might you be going, Your Honor?" The marshal's hand fell casually to his holster. "I believe we have some matters to discuss." Two deputies materialized from the crowd, taking the judge's arms firmly. Blackwell seemed to shrink into himself as the marshal began reading through the papers Daniel handed him, his expression growing darker with each page. Forged deeds, bribes, witness intimidation. The marshal looked up, his face hard as granite. "Harrigan, step forward." The cattle baron had been trying to edge backward through his wall of hired guns. Now he straightened his vest, attempting to muster his usual arrogant bearing. "This is absurd. You can't possibly believe—" "I believe the evidence in my hands." The marshal's voice cut through Harrigan's bluster like a knife. "These documents bear your signature and seal. The circuit court will be very interested in examining them." He nodded to more deputies emerging from the crowd. "Take him into custody." Harrigan's men reached for their weapons, but their nerve failed as townsfolk pressed in around them. These weren't the cowed settlers they were used to bullying. These were men and women who had found their courage, standing shoulder to shoulder with their Cherokee neighbors against injustice. "Don't be fools," Gray Elk called out to Harrigan's cowboys. "There has been enough violence. Let the law work as it should." One by one, the hired guns stepped back, leaving Harrigan alone. The cattle baron's face twisted with rage as the deputies approached. "You'll regret this, all of you. I own this territory." "Not anymore," the marshal said quietly. "Take him away." Up on the gallows, Elias swayed slightly. The tension that had held him rigid through his ordeal suddenly drained away, leaving him lightheaded. Daniel and Mary Beth rushed back up the steps just in time to catch him as his knees buckled. "Pa!" Mary Beth's arms went around his waist, supporting him. "Are you all right?" "Just tired, girl." Elias's voice was rough with emotion as he gathered both his children close. "So tired, but proud, so proud of you both." Daniel pressed his face into his father's shoulder, no longer caring who saw his tears. "We couldn't let them hang you, Pa, not for doing right." "By the authority of the United States Circuit Court," the marshal's voice rang out across the square, "I hereby declare the previous sentence null and void. Elias Boone is a free man." The cheer that went up seemed to shake the very mountains. Hats flew into the air as the crowd erupted in celebration. Several of Harrigan's former victims began hugging perfect strangers, their joy too big to contain. Sarah Collins pushed through to the gallows steps, her baby crowing happily in her arms. "Bless you, Elias Boone. I told them you were a good man." More townsfolk pressed forward, eager to shake Elias's hand or clap him on the shoulder. Cherokee elders stood with settler families, their previous distrust forgotten in the shared triumph of justice over corruption. The marshal made his way up to the platform, his expression softer now as he watched the scene. "Looks like you've got quite a few friends here, Mr. Boone." More than I knew, Elias said quietly, one arm still around each of his children. More than I deserve, maybe. A man who raises children to stand for truth deserves all the friends he can get. The marshal smiled. I'll need statements from all of you for the circuit court records, but that can wait till tomorrow. Today's for celebrating. Reverend Thompson had begun leading the crowd in a hymn of thanksgiving, his deep voice carrying over the general commotion. Cherokee drums took up the rhythm from somewhere in the crowd, blending with the familiar melody in a new harmony. Sheriff Kincaid approached Elias hesitantly, his hat in his hands. I owe you an apology, Boone. I knew something wasn't right about this case, but I was too cowardly to stand against it. You did right in the end, Elias said simply. That's what matters. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the square where justice had finally triumphed over greed and prejudice. Harrigan and Blackwell sat in the same jail cell where Elias had awaited death, while outside their windows, Cherokee and settlers mingled freely for the first time in living memory. Daniel looked out over the celebrating crowd, his arms still around his father's shoulders. Reckon things might be different in town now, Pa. Reckon they might at that, son. Elias smiled, watching Gray Elk share a handshake with the general store owner who had once refused to serve Indian customers. Reckon they might at that. The empty noose swayed gently in the morning breeze, a reminder of how close they had come to tragedy. But its shadow no longer fell across the platform where a family stood reunited, surrounded by neighbors who had found their better selves in the moment of trial. The autumn wind whispered through yellowing aspens as Elias Boone settled into his worn wooden rocker on the cabin porch. 20 years had weathered the logs and deepened the grooves in the floorboards, each mark telling its own story of the life lived here. The setting sun painted the mountain peaks in shades of amber and rose, reminding him of those first desperate years when 2 small children had transformed his solitary existence. Inside, the iron kettle bubbled on the cook stove, filling the cabin with the rich aroma of venison stew. Daniel and Mary Beth would arrive soon, as they did most Sunday evenings. The thought brought a smile to his weathered face. His son's steady hammer rang out daily at the town forge now, shaping metal as surely as life had shaped their family. His daughter's gentle voice led schoolchildren in hymns that echoed across the settlement, building bridges between peoples who once stood divided. The crunch of wagon wheels on frost-crisp leaves announced their arrival. Daniel's broad shoulders and Mary Beth's graceful form emerged from the gathering dusk, carrying covered dishes and warm greetings. They settled around the old oak table, lamplight casting familiar shadows on the walls, where children's drawings still hung alongside dried herbs and memories. "Pass the cornbread, Pa," Daniel said, his blacksmith's hands surprisingly gentle with the well-used basket. Mary Beth poured fresh milk into tin cups, her eyes bright with tales of her students' progress. Little Sarah Two Rivers read an entire page today, and Tommy Jenkins finally learned Amazing Grace all the way through. Laughter filled the cabin as they shared stories of the week past, the same laughter that had slowly healed this place, transforming it from a lonely hunter's shelter into a true home. Outside, the first snowflakes of winter began to dance in the darkening air. Elias bowed his head, his voice rough with emotion. "Lord, I thank you for your mercy. 20 years ago, I only meant to save 2 children from the storm. Turns out, they saved me instead." Daniel and Mary Beth reached across the table, taking their father's calloused hands in theirs. No words were needed. They knew the bonds between them were stronger than blood, forged in love and tested by fire. The hearth crackled warmly as snow continued to fall, a gentle reminder of that desperate December night when destiny had brought 3 lost souls together and made them whole. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.